Uh, the Washington House is a good place to start. It's one of the oldest brick buildings in the city, and was actually the first Washington House was built in 1852, right on this spot. In 1864, it burned down on New Year's Eve, and they were cooking New Year's Day dinner in the oven, a big turkey, and the place was crowded and packed. It happened to be the coldest night of the year when the fire started. They think it started in the chimney, and everybody escaped. But the only thing left standing in the building, of that original wooden building, was the oven. And in the oven they found the turkey, and the turkey wasn't damaged at all by the fire. They had tried to, they had a pumper fire wagon, but it was so far below zero that it froze up, and they tried a bucket brigade, and nothing they could do to save the place. Next October of 1864, this building opened, and it's been here on the spot ever since. Many years it was a theater and all kinds of good things. Known as the Mermack Hotel, known as the annex of the West Bend Travels, which was the old Wisconsin Hotel. If you want to understand why West Bend was here, this is the halfway spot between Fond du Lac and Milwaukee. The shortest road between the two places. And back in the early days, and the town started in the 1840s, every night the travelers would be coming into town for both directions, and every morning they'd be heading out. So all the businesses along Main Street kind of grew up to supply the hotels and help them entertain the people that came to town. That was the very first hotel in town. Across the way, the old Gondring Tavern, Beard's Garden, or whatever it's called now. But there was a log cabin there, and they had a tavern on the first floor. And upstairs they boarded the men who built the mill. And as I said, West Bend Travels was the old Wisconsin Hotel, dates from the 1890s, and was a very favorite place with the train excursions that came up from Milwaukee. They would bring many cars on the train, and they would have picnics in West Bend. When we get down Main Street, you'll see some other hotels. The old, what's the building south of the theater, where the main exchange, right, is a place where it was the Winan Hotel. Same man that built the Painted Lady over here. Down the way you can see the old brewery. Many of you probably remember the brewery, the big chimney. There were springs all along the river banks, you know, from down there all the way down this way, and they all tasted different because in West Bend, because of the glaciers, there are different kinds of minerals in the springs, and so people would walk long distances to come to drink from their favorite spring. A few more things about the Washington House, because it was really quite a place. The person who built it was Balthazar Getter. You can see his name and initial way up at the top of the building still. He had started the brewery in town and then had an eye infection and had to go out of that business. But it was quite a place. They advertised it all the way down to St. Louis. They were very proud of their wine. Every year Getter would bring over Rhine wine from Germany. Down in the basement among the field stones, they had places to put different bottles. There was a spring in the basement that provided natural air conditioning in the hotel. He was famous for the vegetables he grew out of that. And some of his favorite dishes were asparagus dishes. Also out in the back, this whole block was the hotel. They had vegetables and fruit trees and wood piles, and they had houses where people could wash up and all of these things. The building next door to it is the old brewery jewelry store. Dates to the 1890, I believe. Well, let's head over and down by the river.
Okay. Thanks, Jack.
Yeah, we'll see. It's what they call Cream City brick, and it's the kind of brick that you see a lot of it in Milwaukee. But this brick wasn't made in Milwaukee; it was made up in Barton. Another thing I was going to tell you was that one of the more interesting days back through the years was Napoleon's birthday, because there weren't a lot of Frenchmen in town, but there were some. Some had fought with Napoleon's armies, and so every year on his birthday they'd put their three-cornered hats on and three of them would march right down the middle of Main Street to the Washington House, and then they would proceed to celebrate and to get very drunk. So Napoleon's name was a well-known name in town. One day, everybody in town woke up and found that this wasn't West Bend anymore. It was Lamartine City. And Lamartine was a famous French patriot. And somehow or other, they had gone to the county board meeting and changed the name of the town. So the Frenchmen here had a good sense of humor and enjoyed it. It took one day and they changed it back to West Bend again. Let's head down by the river. This was a kind of an interesting spot because 10 years after the first settlers came to town, they had a lynching right in here, the lynching of George DeBar. And it started up by the old courthouse where we're going to end our tour. A mob broke through and grabbed George DeBar, who was suspected of having killed a hired boy in town. George was a member of the Know Nothing Party. He was only 18, very sickly young man, a Yankee. And the Germans in town were very suspicious of the Know Nothing Party, which was also called the Order of the Star Spangled Banner. It was a secret society. It was kind of like the Ku Klux Klan and a lot of the right-wing groups, but a lot of the very respectable Yankee citizens belonged to it. And they call them the Know Nothings because if you said, well, tell me about what you do, and they would say, I know nothing. They had colored pieces of paper they would use to give secret messages to each other, secret handshakes. Anyway, went out towards Newburgh, out about as far east as the sewer plant is. When a German hired boy was killed, George DeBar was caught in Milwaukee, arrested, put in the courthouse. They brought in troops from Port Washington to Milwaukee to guard him, but when they took him out of the courthouse, several hundred people broke through. They tied a clothesline around his feet and they pulled him feet first through town, down this street. That building over there is still labeled the Old Mill, and the people that have done surveys of the town feel it could indeed be the old Walcott Mill that was originally built in 1844, 1845. But I think that was down right in here at that time. So they hauled George down here and they strung him up by the feet on this side of the river, and then the soldiers managed to cut him down and they dragged him across the river and they hung him and they killed him. And it was kind of a statewide incident. The Know Nothings that year elected, well, they had a candidate for president who actually carried the state of Maryland. It was a very popular movement. They brought 12 Germans to trial for killing George DeBar, and they got off. All their friends and neighbors acquitted them. Their defense was the fact that, yeah, they strung him up, but by the time they strung him up, he was dead already, so they couldn't really have been convicted of murder. And then when they brought him to trial a second time, the judge said, well, this is double jeopardy. They've already been tried once, so you have to let them go. But it was a very scandalous, interesting kind of a thing that happened. As I said, that's not only the old mill, but it's known as the cradle of West Bend industry. That's where the West Bend Company started back in 1911. The pick manufacturing people were there. When Ingerkrest burned down, they moved over and ran out of there. So many of the West Bend businesses and industries have been in that old mill building there. And mills in the early days, you know, they called, part of the reason the town was located here was the rapids. They called rapids community builders because you had to be able, once you cleared your property of trees, you had to be able to have a sawmill to cut the trees into planks to build things out of. And of course they brought the ashes, they burned a lot of the trees, they brought the ashes into the mill. It became a potash type mill where they would get stuff to make glass and different kinds of chemicals. And when the farmers were growing crops, the mills often became grist mills where they would grind the grain into flour. What else should I tell you here? Oh, ice cutting was a big thing in the early days. West Bend shipped boxcars of ice out by railroad. The railroad came in 1871 across the river. That was really what opened up a lot of the settlement across the river. But up by the brewery and up north of there where Silver Creek came down through what today is Regner Park, lots of good ice was harvested. Important thing to remember is if you really want to understand West Bend, you got to Remember the Germans and the Yankees. I gave this talk once, and I had a lady very mad at me. She still doesn't talk to me. She was mad I didn't mention the Irish. We had some wonderful Irish and all kinds of good nationality groups in town. But it was those two groups. The Yankees came first. They wanted wheat land. And they came out of New York and New England and came here, got lots of land to grow wheat. And then after a while, they wanted to move west and get cheaper land. They sold a lot of their land to the Germans, who many of them came in the 1840s, and they were known as 1848ers because in 1848 in Europe they had many revolutions. People wanted to throw the kings over and be democratic and set up their own governments. The revolutions didn't work, and the people had to flee for their lives, and many of them came right here and were the people who founded West Bend. Okay, let's head down this way. The river was the way that the first pioneers came into the area. Down where the river bends to the east down here, they say there was an Indian village when people first came. And the Indians did play an important part when the early settlers came. But of course, as you probably realize, settlement began in this area when the Menominee Indians were relocated to the west on reservations. And that's what opened the land here in the 1840s, basically, for people to come in and establish farms. But up this river is where the French explorers came, and often with the Indians. The first Indians here were the Potawatomis. And back at the time of the American Revolution, many of the Potawatomis were kind of on the side of the pioneers against the English. In fact, it's said that many of them had medals from George Washington for helping with the fight for independence. A little bit about the name of West Bend. It's kind of strange. Nobody knows why they call it West Bend, because we're not located on the west bend of the river. Ordinarily, if you're English or American, you name the bend of the river by when you're going downstream, I think. So it really should be East Bend. The French do name it by coming upstream, but then it should be North Bend. Kewaskum was called North Bend for a while. It was also called Clarence. Again, Carl Quickert, when he writes about how it got its name, he's not really too sure. He feels that Byron Kilbourne, who was a Frenchman, probably played a big role in determining where the town was laid out, probably in part because of his romantic kinds of sensibilities. It was a beautiful place, you know, close to the river, that type of thing. So between the rapids, the halfway point between the two cities, it kind of got located here. There were a couple Indian scares in West Bend back about the beginning of the Civil War. In fact, 2 falls in a row in September. I think the first one, the rumor swept town that the Indians, there was an uprising in Horicon, the Indians were headed this way. So in the middle of the night, people ran out of town. And the one story I like is about the woman, the old woman who was put in a wheelbarrow by her family and trundled down the road to get away from the Indians who never came. A year later, the same kind of a thing happened, and again, there was no truth to it. From what I've read, the white children and the Indian children often played together in those early days. When I was telling you about the springs, which were all along the banks, I didn't mention that, you know, they call the beer here Lithia beer. And the spring that fed the brewery had a high content of lithium in it. So along with the alcohol, there was the lithium to make people feel extra special good when they drank West Bend Lithia beer. Okay, let's head down. We're going to go up between the south of the Ziegler building we put across the state. There were 3 men that really were responsible for founding West Bend here. Byron Kilbourne. Kilbourne Avenue is named after him. And Byron was a very famous person in Wisconsin. He owned all of Milwaukee on the west side of the river. They called that Kilbourne Town. And Dr. Walcott, the mill is named after him, who was a prominent physician down there. And then a man by the name of Neeland. And they got the right from the state to build a plank road. It was a plank road that came out here, heading out to Fond du Lac. And of course it was a toll road. You could make money because you charge people by what they wanted to run down the road. You know, animals paid so much and carts. So it was a kind of a business venture. The railroad was supposed to come through in the 1850s. That's when the railroad went through Slinger and over to the Minnesota border. But an interesting thing happened. Byron Kilbourne and some of these other people, they knew the farmers needed railroads to get their crops to market better, more crops, faster. And it was an important part of the state. But they did an interesting thing. They said to the farmers where they wanted to put the railroad, they said, now we'll tell you, you take out a mortgage on your farm and you buy stock in the railroad, and we'll use the money from your mortgages to build the railroad, and we'll all prosper. Well, that sounds pretty good, except they didn't spend the money on building the railroad, they used it to get rich. And they took the mortgages out east and they sold them again, and sold them a second time. So the time came, there wasn't any railroad, there wasn't any money, and for about 20 years until the early 1870s, there was nothing up here except, you know, dirt roads and plank roads and that type of thing. So finally, for years, they tried to prevent these companies from foreclosing on the farmers, but many farmers in our area lost their farms because of the railroads. And in fact, there were people down in the Richfield, Germantown area who would blow up the railroad bridges at times in order to express their unhappiness at what had happened. When Carl Quickert wrote about the railroads, he talked about that there was a railroad spike driven through every poor man's hearth in the county by the time they were done. It was the railroad across the way that kind of began the traffic, the bridges, and the town began to expand in that direction. There were also, somebody tried to raise grapes here. They did it over in Slinger too and were more successful, but you'd always get a cold winter that would come along and you'd freeze the roots of the trees and it just wouldn't work. But over on that other side of the river, on the east side of the river, they did for a time grow grapes and have wine, and it was said you could tell by the holes in little boys' pants which of them liked to go over there and try to steal grapes, because the people that raised them would use some, not buckshot, but whatever they used to give them a good stinging. But they talked about old grape dreams and, you know, people still having those memories of what happened in the old country. And one more interesting thing about the river, the Kiltau electric plant, back before Wisconsin Power and Light was here, we had our own power company in town. And we also had the first rural electric line in America. It went from right down about where the bank is over in there on Highway 33, and it went, you know, out to County D, is it right? What's the one? B. B, right this side of where the fantasy suites are, yeah. And it ran out in the country and around and back in town. So lots of pioneering kinds of things in terms of industry.
How much land did those guys own together? I mean, were they deeded parts of this area around here adjacent to the railroad?
Which guys now?
Kilbourne, Neeland. Their names are on my abstract.
Yeah, no, I think originally they came in, there was a kind of a squatter here first, Higgins, right? And they had to do some dealing with him, but they owned, I think, a good portion of the land right around the river. And they were, make no mistake about it, they were up here to make money. And there were a lot of people, there were a lot of plank roads in the state. And everybody who made them prospered quite well. The governor of the territory had said, we need these roads to grow. And they got them. Well, let's head up to the top of the hill here. Fun town. It was a lot of the German spirit of Gemütlichkeit. Is that the right way to pronounce it? Okay. Was very evident here. People love to have fun. Over where the outlet mall is across the river, they had a dancing platform. And on one end of it they put a band, on the other end they had a bar, and from the trees they hung lanterns, and Every night they'd have dances and people would enjoy themselves. In fact, one of the early editors kind of joked that the richest people in town were the people who sold the fiddlers catgut for their bows and the shoemakers who had to keep selling the children shoes because they wore them out dancing. The Ziegler Company, there used to be a department store in here. In fact, several department stores. Back in, I guess the 1920s, some of the first adult education started right in here, the forerunner of the vocational school. It was a night school, and they had 40 veterans from World War I. They had 12 businessmen and 10 women who were students at that first night school. Cigars across the way. I picture kind of where the camera shop and the hobby store in there. They had cigar makers along Main Street, and they would name their cigars after, like local communities and things. And it wasn't just a dancing platform, but over beyond the railroad where Engercrest is now, they had a wonderful park with. They actually had kind of an opera house with a stage, and down in the basement they had a place where the turners, the gymnasts could exercise, and you could rent a place where you could have a little picnic grove. And they would bring up many, many cars on a train from Milwaukee where the people would go and spend the day there. Out where the YMCA daycare is, they had what they called the shooting park. And they had colored bottles and things that they would toss in the air and people would shoot at. Down where, near the Dairy Queen, north of there was an island. It was kind of swampy land, and again they had another kind of a resort park down there. I will tell you a little bit more when we get across from the theater. I will tell you a little bit more when we get across from the theater. Back in the 1890s, many people came here, and this was kind of the jumping off spot to go camping out by Cedar Lake in that area. That was a well-known vacation spot in those times. The Old Settlers Park, I'm sure you've all read the sign about how that was a community gathering place. One of the neatest old pictures I've seen of it was the night that World War I ended and all the cars crammed in and people were gathered for miles around to celebrate the armistice ending World War I. It used to be a triangular shaped business over where the bandstand and the fountain and such are. The old O'Meara Law Building, made Ripley's, believe it or not, was the smallest building in the world, they said, that occupied a full city block. We made, believe it or not, a second time during the Depression that said West Bend is the place that always had the Help Wanted sign out. And the reason it did, in part, was again because of the Zieglers, especially old Ben Ziegler, who got his start in West Bend when he was about 18. His father got him a horse and buggy, and he went out selling insurance out in the countryside. Later on, he got a Maxwell car to replace the horse and buggy. But it was a kind of an interesting face-to-face building of what now is one of the outstanding investment firms in the country. The reason we didn't have we had the Help Wanted sign out during the Depression was old Ben Ziegler went down to Kansas in the spring of 1929, and he saw the farmers were having economic problems. And he put two and two together, and he said, hard times are coming. So when he came back to West Bend, they turned all the assets of their companies, and they owned the bank, and they owned the West Bend Company, or were among the many movers and shakers in town that were the owners of these places. They turned it all into cash, and when the crash came, they still had it, and so they kept on, working. It's interesting. I've talked over the years to people that knew Ben Ziegler. One of them said, not long after he started working for the company, Ben called him in and said, do you own your own house? And he said, no, I don't have enough money. And Ben Ziegler said, in effect, nonsense, we'll help you buy your house. They wanted people to live here who were going to live here for a long time and invest themselves in the community. post office up there dates back to 1936. Before then, post offices were located in different shops around town. It was a big thing. You can imagine if you had the post office in your place. You get a lot of people coming from town. 1936, during the Depression, they built this place. There was a stage line that came into town years when the railroad wasn't here. The stagecoach stop was the Washington House. And they ran down to meet the railroad down at, I believe, Cedar Creek. Anyway, down near the Slinger, down in that area. And it was, I think the ride cost like 12 cents, and it was a pretty bumpy, dusty kind of a ride to take. In the early days, the only phones in town connected to businesses, mainly along Main Street. Didn't have a gas company. We did have gas lights. We had a dozen gas lights in town for years. And every night the lamplighter would go around and light the lights. And according to the stories, which I suppose are maybe part story, part legend, all the little boys in town would follow the lamplighter around, and when he passed on beyond a particular lamp, they'd all collect around the base. They'd all inhale together. They'd all blow out together, and they sometimes managed to blow out the lamps that he left. The first store in town was in that empty space right there. I call it the Sharp's Corner store. It was built by one of the Frenchmen, Mr. O'Neill. His son had the first horse in town. I tried to think everybody in the frontier had horses, but they didn't. Horses were very expensive to keep. You had to feed them oats. So oxen were the beast of burden that was most popular. Not only could they haul things around, but you could use them to clear land. They had their strength in their hind legs, and they could pull the logs out. After you grew your crops, they'd pull them down the plank road to the marketplace. And the nice thing about oxen, when they got worn out, they turned them into corned beef. So they were, from the beginning to the end, a very useful animal. The fountain across the way, which isn't running now, I remember when they were building the fountain, and Plaskin, the designer of the downtown, talked about how his dream was to pump old dirty river water out of that fountain into the sunlight and air, run it back down the street into the little fountain we passed here, kind of as a symbol of what had happened to the downtown. I hope someday that comes true. I don't think it's working now in that way, but I hope someday that they'll do that. Well, let's cross the street and head down Main Street. First high school. They were very proud of the high school here. Education has always been a premium thing in West Bend, as you can tell by the high school we have now, all the schools, the Volk Tech School, the university. It was the library too. The recreation building was the library before we built the new library where it is now. Well, it's over the FW building. That's the old Westenberger building. It was noted in the early days not only because it was a fine building, but they had a meat market in there, and they had one whole refrigerated room. In the early days, it was kept cold with block ice, and that was a very proud business fixture. The first bank building was right here, I believe, West Bend Hobby Store. We didn't have banks in West Bend until much later than a lot of other places. And the historians that have looked at the town have wondered about that. If you wanted money, you borrowed it from family and friends, but the banks came in quite late.
They must have bartered then long
I
after.
know. My folks wanted some money to buy their first house in the West Side Forest. And it was such a bargain. They got
If you've never been in there, you should go in sometime and look around. It's really quite elegant. But this was originally the old Hangartner Opera House. It was built in 1893. And up on the top floor, which no longer exists, it burned off in a fire, they had an old opera house with gas lights. And Uncle Tom's Cabin would come to town, and it would be on up there. And they would have roller skating up there. Roller skating was big in West Bend. You read about the early resorts across the river and up here, and they were always having roller skating parties. And when they bring all kinds of interesting people to town to entertain on the roller rinks. Like they had the electrified boy who they would turn out all the lights, and he would skate around with lights coming from batteries in his clothes. And they would have the oldest roller skater and the youngest roller skater, and kind of a fun town to be in. Amity Leather was up on the top floor, back around the time of World War I. Amity Leather started on the upper story of the old Sears building, and it was back on the alley. Down in the basement here, or down on the first floor, they had a soda fountain. Back when Uncle Wonderful was over where the Candy Man is, he had the original furniture that they used as a soda fountain that was there. Let's see. The sidewalks in town, they weren't stone, they were wood sidewalks. It was a very muddy town. And people were always agitating, they wanted better wooden sidewalks. They said, you know, like in the spring when it was really muddy, if you walked down the sidewalk, a couple was walking and they met another couple, you kind of had to stand sideways to let each other go by. It wasn't until the 1890s, really, that we began to spruce things up with sewer and water and some of the modern things of life. I'm sure you've all been in the theater. It's one of those wonderful movie houses, typical of the 20s, where you've got a lot of Mohammedan kinds of decorations in there. They're talking of turning that, I think, into, instead of 2 theaters, 5 or 6 or something. I hope they don't destroy a lot of the wonderful kind of feelings that are in there. The old building over here, you can see 1894 up on the top. Next to it is the old Wine and Hotel. We used to have a nice wooden piece like that there too, but some of the old pictures show horse and buggies parked along in there. Again, a part of the hotel town. One of the dentists in town, is it Baumgartner? Was he one of the old dentists? Yeah, he used to have his office up in the building that says 1894, and then there was a walkway up in the top. You could walk over into the next building. Part of what happened in West Bend, we had a lot of disastrous fires. Sometimes it would burn a whole section of the downtown down, and then they'd come in and rebuild it. So that's kind of what you're looking at when you look at the downtown. I'll tell you a little bit more about the fire department. The whole town was basically built out of wood, white wood. It looked like a New England village. But when they built the brick courthouse, the courthouse there is 100 years old this year. It was built in 1889. They took the old courthouse and they moved it right down here, and it sat here for many years as a hardware store. Before that, the Whiteman Hotel was here. It was again one of the first hotels in town. Well, let's go across, and then we'll stand in the shade, and I'll point out a couple of things. There's a lot of projects in West Bend. Citizens have been very stubborn. They debate things for years before they finally get around to building them. City Hall was one of those things. Library was another one. We had a chance to get a Carnegie grant, I think of $10,000, and we never did take the money. We built it finally with our own money. What you're looking at when you look at the old City Hall there, the tower in the back on this street is part of the old firehouse. That's when they had horses that pulled the fire wagons. That was the tower where they hoisted up the hoses to dry after they had used them. They also had an interesting thing in town. They had the harnesses who hung from the ceiling over the horses, so that when the fire bell rang, you could drop the harnesses right on the horses and be off to the fire very fast. We didn't just have one fire company in town, we had a number of them. The ones I remember the most, they had a German-speaking fire company and an English-speaking fire company. sometimes they competed to see who was going to get to the fire first. Sometimes it said that they even fought with each other to be sure that one of them got there before the others. I've also been told that fire insurance played a big part in whether you got your fire put out. If you put a little sign by your house that told where your insurance was, and if you didn't have the right insurance, sometimes you didn't get your fire put out. Up just north across 7th on that northwest corner was where the first Catholic church in town stood. And back in the early days, they got the first church bell in town would peal out from there in the mornings and the evenings. Of course, one of the famous priests in our history was Father Casper Rero, who operated out of Barton. He was the founder of the Orders of the Sisters of St. Agnes, one of the first American sisterhoods. He had gone to Europe and talked to the Pope to get permission to form an order of teaching sisters so they could have schools. And of course today they're up at Marian College. Up near the water tower, the old convent is still there. It's an apartment building today. Kitty Corner, right up this way when you hit 7th. Right on the corner there is it was the old Holy Angels schoolhouse, parochial school. Later, when it wasn't the school anymore, it became the Schoolhouse Tavern for a while. Up where Blazar's Glass is, that was an old livery stable for many years. And livery stables were a very important thing in a town like this. A place like the Washington House had its own livery stable, and they bragged in their signs and publicity about taking good care of your horse or oxen as they did of you. You can see across the way, you notice across the way it says Pilot. What was the Pilot? Newspaper, right. We had a lot of interesting papers in town. The Pilot and the West Bend News were the two main ones. We also had the Beobachter. Anybody ever see a Beobachter? It lasted until 1917. It was a German paper in town. It actually had more subscribers than the West Bend News. But when World War I came along, we bragged about the fact at the beginning that we didn't have any newspaper carriers. It all went out by mail. We had everybody's name on a mailing list, including the German paper. They were put out by the same company. So when World War I came along, the anti-German feelings were so strong that nobody really wanted to be identified as being German. So they canceled subscriptions to the Beobachter. Carl Quickert, the historian, had come up here and he ran the paper for 17 years, from 1900 to 1917. When it closed, he became one of the editors of the West Bend News. Sager's Department Store is another place where the newspaper headquartered. Underneath the nice green brick on the front, you'll find, I think that was the Pilot office. One more, lots of interesting stories about the newspaper. You can always tell what was the newspaper office in a town because it had the biggest wood pile in town. And that's because in those days, instead of paying cash for things, a lot of times you'd bring them so much wood to run an ad or for a subscription to the paper. And the editors had a lot of fun. When they needed something, they'd write about it. One editor locally wrote about, "Oh, my jaw is really getting pretty rusty and creaky. I could sure use some good butter to lubricate it." And of course, people would bring in butter. Another one wanted some pumpkins, and then he wrote about how he got such big pumpkins. He cut one of them in half, used one half for a hog pen, and the other half for a water cistern that season. When the newspaper would have its offices over near the river, they told how the men who worked there would bring their fishing poles to work and stick them out the windows and fish. They tell us a lot of the young men in town got their first cash-paying jobs at the newspaper. And they would tell how the foreman could be pretty tough. If the men sat down too much to work, he'd come along and cut all the legs off of their high stools that they would sit on. I guess that's enough about newspapers. Let's head down this way. We're going to go up to the old courthouse and then we'll be done. Suddenly, at some point it hit me that part of what was different then was that in the early days, they made what they sold. So if you bought tin goods, you went to a place where you not only bought them from a man, but you bought them from the tinsmith. And if you went to buy furniture, you bought your furniture from the man who made it. Where the Sears building was the old, I got a terrible time with some of these names, the De Tunk furniture maker, who has made such fine furniture that if any of you are interested in antiques, every once in a while in an antique book or magazine you'll come across a picture of a piece of furniture that he made. Look at the old storefronts here. I mean, you can get a feeling of old West Bend sometime by taking a look up. The carpenters who made the furniture also were the undertakers, because they made the caskets. And I remember reading in some of the papers here about when the bombing fluid first came in, and they would brag about it to people to get them to get their business when somebody died. The photographer, the local photographer Schreiber, had his office right along in here. And in the old papers, you see some of his wonderful portraits that he took of the people who lived here. Along in here were some saddle stores and shoe stores and places where, you know, they would kill the animals across the street and butcher them, run the stuff in to the river, and then they would process the hides and make lots of other products. Okay, that goes back to the 1850s, right up on the other side of 7th Avenue. The building here, John's Decorator Place, that's a Lutheran church that goes back to the 1860s, Civil War days. This was called Market Street in the early days, and I assume that just like we have our farmers market today, they probably came in and this was kind of a crossroads with the river. Lots of taverns in town, and often the aldermen and political leaders were people that ran taverns because they knew so many people. And they had drive-ins in those days. The taverns were drive-ins. They had canopies put up where when you came in to spend a little time in the tavern, you could run your horse into the shade and leave him parked there. And they had side rooms for the women to go in because women didn't go into the main tavern with the men. Down here is kind of where the West Bend industry really crystallized. The Gale Company, of course, across the way, but the Schlamer blacksmith and a number of the blacksmiths had their business right down here by the river. Louis Lucas, back in the 1850s from France, was one of the original pioneers in that field. And the man that took over from him was Charles Silverzahn, who helped build some of the ironclad Monitor Merrimack type ships in the Civil War. And then of course the Gale Company came along. And you know, the ingenuity of many of the people that started the industries here, the corn picking machines of the Gale Company put us on the map. And even today, you know, people from China and around the world come to deal with these things. This was kind of the center of town. You know, there was the Lutheran Church and the United Church of Christ and the Catholic Church down here and the Methodists up here. And the first 6 or 7 churches that they had here have lasted to this day. There's a lot more than that now. The thing that split the churches apart a lot was language. They had a lot of fights about, you know, should we worship in German or in English? Should we have a school where the kids learn to speak English or where we keep teaching them how to speak German? And that was some of the things that split the churches apart. Now let's head up the street. Came here. These were well-educated people. They called a lot of the German farmers who came here Latin farmers, not because they came from Italy, but because they could read Latin and they could read Greek. They came out of universities. And when they came, they often, part of what they chose to pack in these limited space in their trunks was books, including Latin books. The story I like is about Hans Pilatka, who went up to Kewaskum with a group of other Germans. They were going to revolutionize the frontier with a great farming community. They had all these wonderful ideas, and none of them lasted much more than one summer, because Hans Pilatka, for example, didn't know how to build a house, and all summer long he had to take an umbrella to bed. It was a very rainy summer, and his young bride and him would have to put up the umbrella in order to keep the water from leaking through the roof on them. Well, Hans, after a year, went down to Milwaukee, taught music, founded the Milwaukee Choral Society, later founded the Chicago Choral Society. There were lots of people like that here, very interesting kinds of people. We had, you know, women's choirs and men's choirs, Männerchor, Liederkranz, We had a lot of schools, and private schools where you had to pay to send your kids, as well as the public schools. Mr. DeTunk, the carpenter, lived right over there in that little building on the other side of the parking auto teller thing, and the ginseng over here belonged to him. The Masons, you see their place next to the Washington House today, but we had the Masons and we had the Turners. And for years the Masons had their place right down about where the tennis hardware store is. Well, let's head up there. But I did want to point out just the Hydras Hall. If you look at some of these wonderful old houses, you think it says something about the size of the family, different style of life and work custom to. I think most of you heard me say that the doctors, we didn't have a hospital like this in the 1930s where you got the hospital up where it was. Most doctors would either have a few rooms in their house where people who were quite sick would come and stay at. In Hyder's case, he took the building next door and used that. This was the South School, not this building, but the South School building. It was an old blacksmith shop. This is probably one of the most interesting historical houses in town. Down on Main Street, you can see the beautiful lines of it. That was the old Leander Frisbee house. Leander Frisbee was one of our first attorneys. He went on to make quite a name for himself. He ended up being Attorney General of the state of Wisconsin. And he had some very creative things. It said that, well, I've been up in that top part, and you can really look down the river quite a ways, and you could see who was coming in and out of town and keep good track of things, as well as seeing a lot of what was happening in the village itself. But a couple interesting things, you really ought to go in and visit there. The banister that goes upstairs, down at the very bottom, the little banister that rises up, there's a secret compartment in there. Many architects used to, when they build houses, hide the plans there, and there wasn't no plans there that they could find. There are some interesting marble fireplaces, a wonderful reservoir system where they collected the rainwater and channeled it down into the basement. I think the most intriguing thing is there really aren't any doors as such, or there weren't originally. They were all windows, and the windows go right down to the floor. And when you raise them up, they disappear up into the ceiling. The reason was that when they figured the tax on your house, they would count the number of doors. And by not having any doors, I assume you didn't get away without paying taxes, but it was kind of the idea. Let's see. The Gallery of Fine Arts dates back to the 60s. And of course, when you get in there, we hope you all will go in because they're expecting it. They'll show you some of the really famous work that's been done there by Carl von Marr, who was a relative of Joan Pick and the Pick family. And of course, a lot of what they've done over the years is to collect his work in this wonderful mural they've got in there. Carl von Marr was born in Milwaukee back in the mid-1800s and studied over in Germany. When the people did the architectural survey of town, they pointed out that when you go down this street up to the western edges, up where the cemetery is, and on the next street, you will find in every block houses that were built all through the history of West Bend, and they were quite impressed with this. They feel at some point that ought to be kind of a historical area, along with Barton. They feel Barton is a very historic place. Well, let's go finish our...
We lived up 3 blocks and we had a sprinkler basement before.
The draft commissioner, when they first came here to draft people, and they read the names, pulled them out, and read them for each of the towns. When they were reading the town of Trenton, at one point a man from the town of Trenton got up and stood on a chair and said, we don't like this kind of stuff. These people had come from Germany to get away from kings and having to fight in armies. They had the crops to put out, and they didn't like this. So they chased the draft commissioner out of town. He ran down to the Frisbee house and in the back door and out the front door, got on his horse, escaped to Milwaukee, telegraphed the governor, and a few days later they had troops in town, and they did have the draft. At the same time, a day earlier over in Port Washington, when the draft commissioners came, they beat up on them. They didn't beat up on them here. And when the troops came to have the draft over there, they found that they had put some cannons up on the hill, and they were prepared to fight to protect their independence. But you can read names. All the names are there. It's really a wonderful kind of a history. The editors, some of the editors of the West Bend News went off to fight in the war and would write letters back, and it's all preserved on microfilm of the old newspapers. The Methodist Church, we had a German and English Methodist church in town too. Interesting, just a kind of a side note, the Methodists and Baptists and the Catholics did great things in reaching the frontier. The Methodists had circuit riders, and we were served by a circuit rider. They had a Methodist minister who rode from Green Bay to Chicago and back. And when he would come through here, he would marry anybody who needed to be married and baptize the babies and hold communion and go on to the next place. And so the Methodists were very successful in being on the frontier. The Baptists were very successful too. They didn't have trained ministers like the Methodists did. They just picked the best person that they felt could preach a sermon, and he was their minister. And so they always had leadership too. And I told you about Caspar Rero, the man up in Barton. He had his own printing press with German letters, and he wrote 2 books of theology. And not only did he form this order, but he was a real kind of a profound thinker that started things too. Okay, we're out. One more stop, and that bar was seized as he came out of the old wooden building that was there, and then dragged down by the clothesline down Main Street and lynched. The road up there, that was the first road in town, Chestnut Street. They called it Decorah Road with a K. And instead of the Decorah that's further south, it was named after an Indian chief up in Kewaskum. It was a military road. The federal government built that road to link the Great Lakes with the Mississippi River, to march soldiers along that street in the east and west in case of Indian uprisings. The very first settlers in town, they had farms down where the Badger School is, and then kind of kitty corner across through the stoplights where that shopping center is.
My husband lived there too.
He either didn't pay his rent or no.
His folks moved a lot, and his cousin, Fat Nauman, was his uncle, who was the sheriff, and his cousins used to live in the jail when this was still the jail.
Well, the jail was interesting because the sheriff's family lived in the front part.
Right.
And of course in the back they had the prisoners, and it's a great place to go and see what they have, because you can see the people they used to look through to check what was happening back there. And for years, somebody can probably tell me better than I, was it the 1950s or so, early 1960s, when they began to shift things over to the new courthouse. The final thing that you need to remember about our county is that originally Ozaukee County and Washington County were one county. And it became, again, a very scandalous and embarrassing thing, because after we became a state, they wanted to turn it, they had to vote to say where we could have the county seat for this huge county. They went all the way to Lake Michigan. And they couldn't get the people to agree. So many different places wanted to be the county seat that they could never get a majority of the voters to agree to any one place. Finally, in one election, they did get a majority for Cedarburg or someplace like this. Then they discovered that a whole community had cast votes where there weren't any people living. And so they threw that out. Finally, the state legislatures decided that they had to stop this. So they said, well, let's make it into 2 counties. And they talked about a line running east to west with a north county and a south county. But the Germans and the Lutherans and the Catholics got mad, because on one side the Lutherans said, well, our kids will have to go to the Catholic school, and the others, the Catholics, said, well, our kids will have to go to the Lutheran school. So that didn't work. Finally, they split it where it is split now, and so they got the 2 counties. And then after it was all done, lo and behold, they discovered there weren't enough square acres of land in Ozaukee County to make it a legitimate county. So they extended the boundaries out into Lake Michigan, and people joked for years about how they had to count the fishes in order to become a county over in Ozaukee County. They wouldn't give us the county records. They hid them. And finally they told us where they were, and well, before they did that, some of the people here went over at night, put bandanas around their faces, snuck into the county courthouse, They were in the process of stealing the records when the sheriff came and arrested them all. And then they hid them. And for years, nobody knew where the records were, which was hard if you wanted to deal with property transactions. And finally, they found them, except for one book, which for years they couldn't find. And finally, when they were tearing down a business in downtown Port Washington, there between the walls, they found this last book of records hidden. The statue down there, up there of the soldier, dates back to 1927. But I think the thing you need to remember and think about our town is what was there about our town that we managed to build so many international businesses? I mean, it's so fun. You go down to Mexico. One of the last times we were down, we looked out in the kitchen on an island in the Caribbean, and there was a West Bend coffee maker. And it's like, you know, the things that are made here are used around the world. I kind of think, you know, the people who founded the industries lived here. This was their hometown. Today you got to kind of watch it because so many places become owned by places that are far away, and instead of, they kind of look at the bottom line. And we who lived here know that we're not bottom line people, we're top drawer, and that's kind of been a part of our heritage. Leave you with this thought. I like to think about the boys that followed the lamplighter and tried to blow out the lamps. It's been a lot of tough years since 1845, and people have indeed seen the lamps dim and flicker a lot. But there's something special about this county and this town and this place that you can't really blow the lamps out. It's a neat place to live, and I think the best days are still ahead. You've been very patient. I'm not sure if the Historical Society is open, but I know that right now, over at the art gallery, they're expecting at least some of you to come over and get cooled off a little bit and look at a mural or two. There's a neat exhibit in there. Or maybe they've changed it, I guess.
The German, are we into the German one?
Must be, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
The last
other
one
was portraits.
Well, let's walk around the